Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. With me today is Daniel McAdams. Daniel, good to see you.
Good morning, Dr. Paul.
Good. Today is an anniversary, not one to be too joyous about. It's 70 years since the United States government bombed Hiroshima. And of course, there's been a lot of discussion over the past 70 years on just why that came about. Was it necessary? Did it end the war? And we'll talk a little bit about that. But it was a major event. Matter of fact, although at that particular time of the bombing, I was 9 years old. I was 10 by the time the war ended, so it was in August. But nevertheless, it was a vivid memory for me, and that is the reason that I put a little clip in Swords into Plowshares. I want to read just what was in my mind about this, because I mentioned in the book that at an early age, that's all I ever heard about was war and war stories. Even mostly throughout my life, there was some war going on that we had to concern ourselves about. But this is a short paragraph, and it tells you a little bit about what was going on in a personal way. My mother frequently delivered news to my dad as he worked in the dairy, which was in the basement of our home. They both were obviously opposed to the horrors of war, but my mother more often expressed her disdain for war. She had a great desire for the war to end. I know exactly where I was on July 16th, 1945. I was assisting my dad in the milk bottling business in our basement. My mother, after hearing on the radio about the news of the first atomic being exploded at Alamogordo, New Mexico, rushed to tell my dad with great excitement. The excitement came, of course, because it was now everyone's opinion that the war would soon end. Victory in Europe, VE Day, had already been accomplished on May 8th. Of 1945. Little did my mother or anybody else realize at the time, knew how unnecessary it was to quickly follow through with the use of nuclear weapons on both Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The bomb was successfully tested on July 16, 1945. Just 21 days later, on August 6th, Hiroshima was bombed, Nagasaki was bombed 3 days later on August 9th. Seemed like they were in a big hurry. The official end to the war came on VJ Day, September 2nd. So those just are a few memories that I had. But the controversy on whether it was good, bad, or indifference, obvious at that time, my impression, everybody else, was that this was good. It was a bomb. It would end. And it was also excitement near that time because we had heard the news since VE Day was announced that Russia would come in and join us, so the war was essentially over. As the years went on, obviously I had a lot more questions about whether or not this was wise and whether or not this cheering will continue forever.
Yeah, it was a few years later, but growing up in the early 70s, it was the same thing. My grandparents lived through the war, and it was universally accepted that this ended the war quicker, therefore it was universally good and not to be questioned. But as you say, we have learned more, we have thought more and reflected more in the decades that have followed. And we were looking at a poll earlier today that showed that really only 56% still say that the use of those atomic weapons, against which we should remember are two civilian centers, they're two cities, not military bases, whether those are justified.
Yes, and there has been a shift right afterwards, back near the time when I was talking about in the book. 87% supported it because that was the position. But it's gradually changed, but it's still very, very strong with Republicans. 74% of the Republicans. So I guess when people call the Republican Party the war party, there's probably some truth to this. Nevertheless, even if you have a war party and a less war policy, it seems like there may be some individuals who have something to say about our foreign policy and our war policy that supersedes the political party. But anyway, the Republicans are certainly more supported. But there was one shift in that polling that I thought was interesting, because less than a majority now of young people under 30 say that it was unnecessary. So slow, to change, but that attitude at least shows that young people have a healthier attitude and maybe a greater reluctance to engage in these wars.
You know, our friend Jacob Hornberger had a really powerful piece this week that we put up on the Institute's website. And he makes, I think, a very interesting and important point. He says, did the bombing of the civilians in Hiroshima and Nagasaki save U.S. soldiers' lives? And he answered, undoubtedly it did, but that still does not give moral or legal justification to target civilian centers. He talks about the laws and the rules of war, both moral and legal.
Well, I think he's right. It did save lives if they would have gone on and invaded. But I don't happen to believe now, and looking back, there was an absolute need to have beachhead landings in Japan and go ahead and do the stuff they were doing on Okinawa and all these other places. Those sort of were like suicide missions. Besides, there's evidence now that the Japanese were much more ready to settle this and had been talking about it, especially after Hiroshima. I mean, they were on the verge of saying we surrender, we surrender. But they always said, the Americans always said, unconditional surrender. And that meant giving up their emperor, who was a god figure, Hirohito. And yet we ended up doing it anyway. So I would say that, yes, if we'd have invaded it, there'd have been a lot of Americans killed. But Japan was destroyed. By that time, they didn't have an army or navy. They probably had some army, but their air force was destroyed and their navy was gone, and they were on the verge of it. But there was no backing back. I think the Soviets had a lot to do with putting pressure on. I think this was the beginning of the Cold War, because the Soviets wanted to come in and help and share in the looting and the taking over of Japan and occupying some of their islands. So I think it was almost like, we got to go fast, we got to move, and make sure that we're totally in charge. So that, I think, had something to do with it as well.
You can almost wonder if the war machine was worried after the war was coming to a close and they needed to gin up a new Cold War. Because after the end of the Cold War, when we thought there'd be a peace dividend, then they had to gin up Iraq and then the war on terror and so on. So.
Well, and I talk a little bit about that in the book, too, because it wasn't too many years later that I remember my mother once again expressing disdain over Korea, another one. How can we put up with another war? So it was, and that was just a few years later, and a significant event. You know, if we look at war in general, we can criticize the bombing just under the just war theory, because two principles there mentions the fact that there should be proportionality, and this seems like it's not proportionate, and you're not supposed to attack on purpose civilians. But there are reports written historically now that said that they deliberated on this, the American leaders, and thought that it has to be dramatic, and there has to be so dramatic, and if it takes civilians, because we have to, put such fear into them that they will come to their knees. So it was a purposeful thing to do this. It was to make it as disastrous as possible. And one thing I learned, maybe I relearned it, but I was not quite aware of what Nagasaki meant, because it was the most Christianized city in Japan. There was a lot of sympathy. So we had Christians in the air dropping down and killed probably 9,000 Christians in Nagasaki. So this, of course, if you look at it in proportion to how we got involved in World War I and some of the lead up, but once we're there, it just seems that the growing number of American people who finally look at this more objectively are starting to say it was not a moral, ethical thing to do, and that there were other ways that we could have handled this.
I wonder about the idea of total surrender and how war propaganda may affect the perceptions of the population, because, in World War I, King Karl of Hungary tried to negotiate a separate peace. They wanted out of the war, and they were not allowed out of Germany's orbit and were completely and utterly destroyed. And the same was true, as you say, about Japan. So I wonder how characterizing the Hun and the Jap and this sort of thing.
Well, it's discouraging, and that's why one of my conclusions here is to suggest that if the governments won't stop the war, the soldiers ought to. The soldiers who, when they realize what they're doing, they don't want any part of it, and usually they don't want any part of it before it starts. So maybe it's the young people or the people in the 60s. They were considered radical leftists, but they were tax rebellion against spending their money to pay for these wars. So people really have something to say about it. They put their bodies on the line, and they have to put the funds on the line. So hopefully we have better government and principled people, and maybe if they followed the Constitution, it would help as well. But this attitude that we have to do it, and that even if you are a president that has some peaceful inclinations and wanting to open up trade with China, with Cuba, well, China too, Cuba, as well as talking with the Iranians, to get it done, our president has to come and show how tough he is. So in his proposal to try to get people to come over, he says, I'm not fearful of this. I bomb countries too, and bragged about bombing 7 countries?
Yeah, Glenn Greenwald wrote about that in The Intercept today. This was his justification. I'm a big bomber, don't worry.
Yeah, but the other statistic that bothers me too is since 1980, even though the Cold War was still going on there, that we have been involved in bombing or invading or occupying 14 Islamic countries. And then you say, do they have any reason to be unjustified? Did one of those countries ever attack us? And attacking us doesn't mean if we're flying over their country, bombing them, that somebody takes a rifle and shoots at them. Oh, that's an aggression, which was argued when we were going up to the Iraq War.
Hearing the stories of the people that survived the 2 Japanese cities and the horrors that they went through, and some of them were a lot of them were children, none of them were combatants in the city really, and so the targeting of civilians is really the issue, and we talked about this before the show. Have we learned anything from this? And the conclusion has to be, in a way, although it's not as spectacular, but we haven't learned much, because if you look at, we talked about yesterday, the drones. If you look at how sanctions target civilians, they don't hurt the regime. They
Children.
Don't hurt and it goes back to the famous story of Madeleine Albright. I think it's the worst example.
Yeah. That's the price you have to pay.
500,000 dead Iraqi children. Was it worth it? Yes. So we haven't learned a lot, but fortunately, as you say, the young people seem to be learning a little bit.
There's hope. Usually wars end when both sides get exhausted or feel like they're totally destroyed, but there are others that argue there are no victors in war. I'm not sure that's an absolute, but generally that, long term that is the case. You fight the war, and the victors, how much have they lost, and how long does the penalty last with them as far as financial and injuries go? I mean, we win all the wars, and like Colonel Tu after Vietnam, when he was talking to an American, he said, well, and the American was bragging, we beat you every time militarily. And Tu says, you're correct, I acknowledge that, but it was irrelevant. So you can win militarily and still lose the battle eventually. Anyway, thank everybody for tuning in today on this anniversary that shouldn't be a celebration, but it should be a call to thinking about war issues and why it's good to understand history, because certainly there's a better way to handle the affairs of the nations throughout the world. And as far as I'm concerned, that the dropping of 2 atomic bombs was not necessary and did not save us from anything, and it's so fearful now that was a small bomb compared to a hydrogen bomb. But ultimately, though, it's not the guns that kill, as many conservatives know and understand. It is only the people that do it. So it's the governments, it's the soldiers, it's the population, it's the war propaganda, it's the military-industrial complex. They're the ones who cause the war, not the people. It is not caused by the weapon itself. The weapons are incidental and instruments of war, but ultimately it's the people that makes the difference, because our friends around the world, we don't even talk about these things. So it's more important that we have friends, and this was the advice of the founders. Respond to honest friendship with everybody who desires it, and stay out of the entangling alliances, and we would have a much more peaceful world. And let's just hope that that we see this transition continuing, that not only will the young people reject the notions of needless war, but the older folks will join us in that effort as well. Thank you very much for tuning in today to the Liberty Report, and return soon.